The ancient stone walls of Valdoria Castle had witnessed many sorrows, but none quite like this. Princess Isabella stood at the tall windows of the throne room, her emerald dress rustling softly as she watched the last of the autumn leaves fall from the oak trees in the courtyard below. The silence that had settled over the palace was different from the usual quiet moments between royal duties. This was the silence of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for news that everyone feared would come. Prince Alexander paced behind her, his military boots echoing against the marble floor. At 28, he had always been the steady one, the brother who could calm any storm with his gentle words and warm smile. But today, even his usual composure was cracking. His dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his blue eyes, so much like their father's, were red with unshed tears. "The doctors have been in there for hours," Isabella whispered, not turning from the window. Her voice carried the weight of someone trying to be brave when everything inside her was breaking. Surely they would have come out by now if there was good news. Alexander stopped pacing and moved to stand beside his sister. At 26, Isabella had always been the heart of their family, the one who could make their stern father laugh and their worried mother smile. Her long auburn hair caught the late afternoon light, and Alexander remembered how their father used to say she looked just like their grandmother, the beloved Queen Eleanor, when the sunlight touched her hair that way. The siblings had grown up in this palace, running through these same corridors as children, playing hide and seek in the library, having sword-fighting lessons in the courtyard. Their father, King Edmund, had been more than just a ruler to them. He had been their teacher, their protector, and their greatest supporter. When Alexander had wanted to serve in the military before taking on royal duties, it was their father who had supported his decision. When Isabella had insisted on studying medicine alongside her royal education, it was their father who had found the best tutors in the kingdom. Now, King Edmund lay in the royal chambers, fighting for his life after a sudden collapse during the morning council meeting. The kingdom's finest physicians had been summoned, but the hours of waiting had stretched on endlessly. The palace staff moved through the halls like ghosts, speaking in whispers, their usual cheerful chatter replaced by worried murmurs and anxious glances. Queen Marian had not left her husband's side since he had fallen. The servants who had glimpsed her through the slightly open chamber door described a woman transformed by fear and love, holding the king's hand and speaking to him in soft tones, as if her voice alone could anchor him to the world. "Do you remember when we were children, and Father would tell us stories about the old kings?" Isabella asked, finally, turning from the window to face her brother. "He always said that the castle itself was alive, that it could feel the emotions of everyone within its walls." Alexander nodded, managing a small smile despite the circumstances. He said the stones remembered every laugh, every tear, every moment of joy and sorrow, and that when times were darkest, the castle would hold us up with the strength of all those who came before us. As if summoned by their memories, the massive oak doors to the throne room opened slowly. Both siblings turned, their hearts racing, as Dr. Harrington, the kingdom's chief physician, entered. His face was grave, and his usually pristine white coat was wrinkled from the long hours of work. Behind him came several other doctors, their expressions equally somber. Dr. Harrington had served the royal family for over 20 years. He had delivered both Alexander and Isabella, had tended to their childhood illnesses, and had been like an uncle to them. Seeing the pain in his kind eyes now made the reality of the situation hit both siblings like a physical blow. "Your Highnesses," Dr. Harrington began, his voice carefully controlled but heavy with emotion. "I must speak with you about His Majesty's condition." The words hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Isabella reached for Alexander's hand, and he squeezed her fingers tightly. Whatever they were about to hear, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else in their lives. Outside, the sun continued to set behind the mountains that surrounded their kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The people of Valdoria were beginning to light candles in their windows, a tradition that started whenever the royal family faced difficulty. From the castle walls, the warm glow of thousands of tiny lights could be seen spreading across the countryside like stars coming to life on earth. The kingdom loved their king, and they loved his children. Whatever news was about to be shared within the palace walls, the people of Valdoria were already preparing to support their royal family through whatever darkness lay ahead. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to absorb not just the sorrow within its walls, but also the love and loyalty of an entire nation, holding it all together with the strength that had endured for centuries, Dr. Harrington's words cut through the silence of the throne room like shards of ice. King Edmund had suffered a massive stroke, and, while he was stable for now, the damage was extensive. The man who had ruled Valdoria with wisdom and compassion for 30 years might never wake up, and if he did, he would likely never be the same. Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Alexander's grip on her hand tightened until it was almost painful, but she welcomed the anchor it provided. Through the roaring in her ears, she could hear Dr. Harrington explaining about brain scans and treatment options, but the words seemed to come from very far away. How long? Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the medical terminology with startling clarity. Dr. Harrington looked down at his hands before meeting the prince's eyes. Days, perhaps weeks if we're fortunate. But, Your Highness, you must understand that even if His Majesty survives, the likelihood of him returning to his duties as king is. He paused, searching for gentle words, extremely unlikely. The weight of those words settled over the siblings like a heavy cloak. Isabella had always known that one day Alexander would become king, but they had imagined their father would be there to guide him through the transition, to share his wisdom and experience. The thought of losing him now, when they still felt like children who needed his advice and protection, was almost unbearable. May we see him? Isabella asked, her voice steady despite the tears that were now flowing freely down her cheeks. Dr. Harrington nodded. Your mother is with him now. She hasn't left his side since this morning. Perhaps it would be good for her to see you both. The walk to the royal chambers felt endless. Servants they had known their entire lives lined the corridors, their faces filled with sympathy and sorrow. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had practically raised both children alongside their parents, stepped forward as they passed. Without a word, she pulled both siblings into a fierce hug that smelled of lavender and fresh bread, the same comfort she had offered when they were small and had scraped their knees or suffered their first heartbreaks. Your father is the strongest man I know, she whispered against Isabella's hair. And you two are his greatest achievements. Whatever happens, he knows that. The door to the king's chambers stood slightly ajar, and, through the gap, they could see their mother sitting beside the massive four-poster bed where their father lay. Queen Marianne looked smaller than they had ever seen her, her usually perfect posture curved with exhaustion and grief. Her golden hair, always arranged in elegant styles for public appearances, hung loose around her shoulders like a young girl's. Isabella knocked softly before entering, and their mother looked up with eyes that were red from crying but still held the strength that had made her a beloved queen. At 45, Marianne had been ruling alongside Edmund since she was barely older than Isabella was now. She had learned to be strong in public and vulnerable only in private, but today the lines between those worlds had blurred completely. My darlings, she said, rising to embrace them both. I'm so glad you're here. King Edmund looked peaceful as he lay surrounded by the soft blue and gold fabrics of his chamber. Machines beeped softly around him, monitoring his vital signs, but his face was relaxed, almost as if he were simply taking an afternoon nap as he sometimes did in his study after a particularly challenging council meeting. Isabella approached the bed hesitantly, as if moving too quickly might disturb the fragile balance that was keeping her father alive. His hand, which had always seemed so strong and capable when he placed it on her shoulder during difficult moments, now looked pale and still against the crisp white sheets. Papa, she whispered, using the name she had called him as a small child, before royal protocol had taught her to address him as father or Your Majesty in public. Papa, we're here. Alexander stood on the other side of the bed, his hand resting gently on their father's shoulder. The kingdom needs you, father, he said quietly. We need you. Queen Marianne moved to stand beside her son, her hand finding his free one. The doctors say we should talk to him, she said softly. They believe he can hear us, even if he can't respond. And so they talked. They told him about the letters of concern that had already begun arriving from neighboring kingdoms. They shared memories of their childhood, reminding him of family vacations to their summer palace by the sea, of the time Isabella had convinced him to let her adopt 3 stray cats who still lived in the palace gardens, of the pride in his eyes when Alexander had graduated from military academy. Isabella told him about the medical research she had been working on, hoping to help improve healthcare in rural areas of the kingdom. Alexander shared his ideas for strengthening their military alliances while maintaining the peaceful relationships their father had built over decades of careful diplomacy. As the evening wore on, other members of the royal household began to arrive. Edmund's younger brother, Prince Charles, traveled from the northern province where he served as governor. The king's closest advisors and longtime friends came to pay their respects and offer their support to the family. Each visitor brought stories of how King Edmund had touched their lives, of his kindness, his wisdom, his dedication to their kingdom. The stories painted a picture of a man who had truly lived his life in service to others, who had earned the love and respect of his people not through fear or power, but through genuine care and consistent integrity. Late that night, when most of the visitors had gone home to their own families, the 4 core members of the royal family remained in the king's chamber. Isabella had curled up in a chair beside the bed, fighting sleep because she couldn't bear the thought of missing a moment if her father woke up. Alexander sat in the window seat, watching the candles still flickering in windows across the kingdom. Queen Marianne had returned to her place beside her husband, holding his hand and humming softly, the same lullaby she had sung to her children when they were small. The palace around them had settled into the deep quiet of night, but it was no longer the frightening silence of the afternoon. Now it felt like the whole castle was keeping vigil with them, holding them all in its ancient embrace while they waited for dawn and whatever it might bring. Dawn came slowly to Valdoria Castle, filtering through the heavy curtains of the king's chamber in pale golden streams. Isabella woke to find herself covered with a soft blanket that someone had draped over her during the night. Her neck was stiff from sleeping in the chair, but she immediately turned her attention to the bed where her father lay unchanged, his breathing steady but shallow. Queen Marianne was awake, still holding Edmund's hand, her thumb tracing gentle circles on his palm. She looked as though she hadn't slept at all, but there was a strange peace in her expression, as if the long night of vigil had brought her some kind of acceptance. "Any change?" Isabella whispered, not wanting to disturb the quiet that had settled over the room. Her mother shook her head slowly. "Dr. Harrington checked on him an hour ago. He says the next few days will be critical. His body is fighting, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge how fragile their father's hold on life really was. Alexander appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with tea and fresh pastries from the kitchen. Despite everything happening around him, he had remembered that none of them had eaten since the previous morning. It was such a typically thoughtful gesture that Isabella felt her throat tighten with fresh tears. "Cook insisted," he said quietly, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "She said father would be furious if he found out we weren't taking care of ourselves." The mention of their father's protective nature brought small, sad smiles to all their faces. King Edmund had always been the kind of man who would notice if someone looked tired or worried, who would personally ensure that everyone around him was comfortable and cared for. It was one of the qualities that had made him not just a respected ruler, but a truly beloved one. As they shared the simple breakfast, Dr. Harrington arrived with his morning report. The king's condition remained stable, but there had been no improvement overnight. More specialists were being called in from the capital city, but everyone understood that there were limits to what even the finest medical care could accomplish. "There are other matters we need to discuss," Dr. Harrington said gently, his eyes moving between Alexander and the Queen. "The kingdom needs leadership, and there are decisions that cannot wait indefinitely." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. While they all hoped and prayed for the king's recovery, the reality was that Valdoria needed someone to make the daily decisions that kept the nation running. Trade agreements needed approval, diplomatic correspondence required responses, and various crises both large and small demanded royal attention. Queen Marianne looked at her son with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. "Alexander, your father and I have discussed this possibility many times over the years. He always said that if something happened to him, he had complete confidence in your ability to lead." Alexander felt the enormous weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. At 28, he had been preparing for kingship his entire life, but he had always imagined having his father beside him for many more years, offering guidance and wisdom. The thought of ruling without that support felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Isabella rose from her chair and moved to stand beside her brother. "Father wouldn't have trained you all these years if he didn't believe you were ready. And you won't be alone. Mother will be there to advise you. And I'll help however I can." Over the next few hours, as word spread throughout the kingdom about the king's condition and the likelihood that Prince Alexander would need to assume royal duties, representatives from various government departments began arriving at the palace. Each brought urgent matters that required royal decision or approval. Alexander found himself thrust into a whirlwind of meetings and briefings. Finance ministers explained the status of the kingdom's treasury and upcoming budget decisions. Military advisors updated him on security concerns and alliance obligations. Agricultural specialists reported on the harvest season and food distribution programs. With each meeting, Alexander felt the full scope of his father's daily responsibilities becoming clear. King Edmund had made it all look effortless, but now Alexander could see the countless details, decisions, and considerations that went into ruling even a peaceful, well-organized kingdom like Valdoria. Throughout the day, Isabella divided her time between staying with her father and supporting her brother. Her medical training proved unexpectedly valuable as she helped interpret the doctor's reports and ensured that their father was receiving the best possible care. Her education in statecraft, which she had pursued alongside her medical studies, allowed her to offer insights and assistance as Alexander navigated his new responsibilities. As the afternoon wore on, news arrived that touched the hearts of the entire royal family. Citizens throughout Valdoria had begun organizing prayer vigils for their king. Churches of every denomination had opened their doors for continuous services. In the capital city's main square, thousands of people had gathered to sing hymns and share stories about how King Edmund had touched their lives. Letters and telegrams poured in from around the world. Fellow monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers sent messages of support and concern. But perhaps most meaningful were the simple notes from ordinary citizens. Farmers whose livelihoods had been saved by the king's agricultural programs, students who had received royal scholarships, families who had met the king during his regular visits to schools and hospitals throughout the realm. One letter, written in a child's careful handwriting, particularly moved the royal family. 10-year-old Emma from a small village near the mountains wrote, "Dear Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella, I met your father when he came to our school last year. He listened to my poem about butterflies and told me I should keep writing. Please tell him that I wrote a new poem just for him, and I hope it helps him get better. Love, Emma." Isabella read the letter aloud in her father's chamber, her voice breaking slightly on the words. Even in his unconscious state, King Edmund's face seemed to soften slightly, as if some part of him could hear the love and concern of his people flowing toward him. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains for the second time since the king had fallen ill, the royal family gathered once more around his bed. Alexander had survived his first day of handling royal duties, though the weight of permanent responsibility still felt crushing. Isabella had spent time researching her father's medical condition, consulting with specialists around the world in hopes of finding some treatment option that might have been overlooked. Queen Marianne had barely left her husband's side, maintaining her vigil with the dedication of someone who believed that love and presence might be the strongest medicine of all. Together, they settled in for another long night of waiting, hoping, and holding on to each other in the face of an uncertain future. The third day brought a sudden change that sent ripples of hope through the castle corridors. Isabella was reading aloud from one of her father's favorite books of poetry when she noticed his eyelids flutter slightly. Her heart pounding, she leaned forward and gently called his name. "Papa, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, King Edmund's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, confused, but they were open. Isabella's gasp of joy brought Queen Marianne rushing from where she had been speaking quietly with Dr. Harrington near the window. "Edmund," Marianne whispered, taking his hand in both of hers. "My love, you're awake." The king's gaze moved slowly from face to face, recognition gradually dawning in his blue eyes. When he tried to speak, his voice was weak and slurred, the words difficult to understand. Dr. Harrington immediately began a series of gentle tests, checking his responses, his ability to follow simple commands, his awareness of his surroundings. Alexander arrived within minutes, having been summoned from a meeting with the treasury officials. The relief on his face was overwhelming as he saw his father's open eyes, but it was tempered by the obvious struggle Edmund was having with basic communication and movement. Over the next several hours, as more specialists arrived and conducted thorough examinations, the extent of the stroke's impact became clearer. King Edmund was awake and aware, but the damage to his brain had affected his speech, his movement on the left side of his body, and his ability to process complex information quickly. Dr. Harrington explained the situation to the family with gentle honesty. "His Majesty has made a remarkable recovery in terms of survival, but the effects of the stroke are significant. With intensive therapy, he may regain some function, but it will be a long process. And, I must be clear, he will likely never be able to resume the full duties of kingship. The king himself seemed to understand much of what was being said, though expressing his thoughts was frustratingly difficult for him. Isabella could see the intelligence and awareness still present in his eyes, trapped behind the limitations his damaged brain now imposed. When he looked at Alexander, she could see him trying to communicate something important, his good hand gripping his son's with surprising strength. "Rest, father," Alexander said gently. "Focus on getting better. Everything else will wait." But King Edmund shook his head slightly, his eyes intense with the effort to convey his thoughts. Finally, with tremendous effort, he managed to whisper one clear word: "King." The implications hung heavy in the air. Even in his weakened state, Edmund understood that Valdoria needed stable leadership, and he was trying to tell his son to accept the responsibility that circumstances had thrust upon him. That evening, after the king had fallen into a natural sleep, the royal family held their most difficult conversation yet. Queen Marianne, Alexander, and Isabella sat in the small private sitting room adjacent to the royal chambers, grappling with decisions that would shape their kingdom's future. "The doctors are hopeful about his recovery," Queen Marianne said, though her voice carried the weight of someone trying to convince herself as much as others. "With time and therapy, he might improve significantly." Alexander nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Even if he improves, mother, it could take months or years. And there's no guarantee he'll ever be able to handle the complex decisions that come with ruling. The kingdom can't wait indefinitely." Isabella had been quieter than usual, her medical training giving her perhaps a clearer understanding than the others of what her father's recovery might realistically look like. "In cases like this," she said carefully, "patients sometimes make remarkable improvements, but they also sometimes plateau at a certain level of function. We need to be prepared for the possibility that this might be as much as he recovers." The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of their lives. They discussed the legal procedures for transferring power, either temporarily through a regency or permanently through abdication. They talked about how to present the situation to the people of Valdoria, who deserved honesty about their king's condition while still maintaining hope for his recovery. Most importantly, they confronted the reality that Alexander would need to step fully into his father's role, not as a temporary caretaker, but as the true leader of their kingdom. The weight of that responsibility, combined with his grief over his father's condition, was almost overwhelming. "I keep thinking about all the things I wanted to learn from him," Alexander confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "All the questions I planned to ask, all the wisdom I thought I'd have years to absorb. How can I possibly rule as well as he has without that guidance?" Queen Marianne reached for her son's hand. "Your father didn't become a great king overnight, Alexander. He learned through experience, through mistakes, through the advice of people who loved him and the kingdom. You have all of that too, plus the foundation he gave you through 28 years of preparation." Isabella leaned forward, her green eyes bright with determination. "And you have us, Alexander. Mother knows more about statecraft than almost anyone in the kingdom, and I can help with domestic policy, healthcare, education reform. We're a team." As they talked through the night, planning for a future none of them had wanted to face, a sense of unity and purpose began to emerge from their grief. They would honor King Edmund by ensuring his kingdom continued to prosper under Alexander's leadership. They would support each other through the challenges ahead, drawing strength from the love and values he had instilled in them. When dawn broke on the 4th day since the king's collapse, it found the royal family changed but unbroken. In the royal chamber, King Edmund slept peacefully, his breathing steady and his color improved. Outside his window, the people of Valdoria were beginning to stir, going about their daily lives with the quiet confidence that their royal family would see them through whatever difficulties lay ahead. The candles that had burned in windows throughout the kingdom still flickered, but now they seemed to burn not just with worry but with hope. Their king might never be the same, but his son was ready to carry on his legacy, supported by a family bound together by love and a shared commitment to serving their people. In a few hours, Prince Alexander would meet with the royal council to begin the formal process of assuming his father's duties. It would be the beginning of a new chapter for Valdoria, one written not in the shadow of tragedy but in the light of hope, continuity, and the enduring strength of a family who had learned that true royalty lay not in crowns and ceremonies, but in the willingness to sacrifice for those they served. 6 months later, Valdoria Castle hummed with a different kind of energy than it had during those dark days in autumn. The same ancient stones that had witnessed such sorrow now echoed with the sounds of a kingdom adapting and growing stronger. In the royal chambers, King Edmund sat in a specially designed chair by the window, his speech clearer than it had been in weeks, watching his son conduct a meeting with foreign ambassadors in the garden below. The road to this moment had been filled with challenges that tested every member of the royal family. Alexander's coronation as King Alexander I had taken place 2 months after his father's stroke, a ceremony that balanced the joy of continuity with the sorrow of circumstances. Edmund, though still recovering, had insisted on attending in his wheelchair, his presence blessing his son's ascension even as it marked the end of his own reign. The new king had faced a share of difficulties in those early months. There had been trade disputes that required delicate negotiation, a brief border tension with a neighboring kingdom that demanded both diplomatic skill and military readiness, and the constant challenge of proving himself worthy of the crown he had inherited earlier than anyone had planned. Isabella had become Alexander's closest advisor, her unique combination of medical knowledge and political understanding making her invaluable in developing new healthcare policies for the kingdom. She had also taken on the role of liaison between the royal family and the people, regularly visiting villages and towns to ensure that the new king's policies were meeting the needs of ordinary citizens. Queen Marianne had emerged as a pillar of strength for both her children and her husband. She had managed Edmund's care and rehabilitation while simultaneously supporting Alexander's transition to power, proving herself to be exactly the kind of queen mother that Valdoria needed during such a crucial period. But perhaps the most remarkable change had been in Edmund himself. While the stroke had robbed him of his ability to rule, it had not diminished his wisdom or his love for his family and kingdom. He had become Alexander's most trusted counsel, offering advice and perspective gained from 30 years of leadership experience. His slower speech and deliberate movements had, if anything, made his words carry more weight when he chose to share them. "You're doing well, my son," Edmund said as Alexander entered his chambers after the diplomatic meeting. His speech was careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had learned not to waste them. "I watched from the window. You handled the trade negotiations exactly as I would have." Alexander smiled, settling into the chair beside his father. These daily debriefs had become one of his favorite parts of ruling. Ambassador Chen was more reasonable than I expected. The textile agreement should benefit both our kingdoms. "And you remembered to ask about his daughter's wedding," Edmund noted with approval. "Personal connections matter as much as political ones. Perhaps more." Isabella appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder of documents, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a complex problem. "The rural clinic program is exceeding all our projections," she announced. "We've reduced infant mortality in the outer provinces by 15% this year." Edmund's face lit up with pride. "Your mother always said you would find a way to heal people, whether or not you became a doctor. You're healing the whole kingdom." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson peered in with the particular smile she wore when she had good news to share. "Your Majesties, there are visitors here who would like to see King Edmund." What followed was one of those moments that reminded the royal family why they served. A group of children from the village school had come to the castle, led by young Emma, the girl who had written the poem during Edmund's illness. Now 11 years old, she had organized her classmates to create a book of stories and drawings about their former king, wanting him to know that they still remembered his visit to their school and the kindness he had shown them. Edmund received the children in his sitting room, his face glowing with joy as they presented their handmade book. Emma, now a confident young writer, read aloud her latest poem about courage and healing. Other children shared drawings of the castle, stories about their dreams for the kingdom, and messages of gratitude for the royal family. "When you came to our school, you told me to keep writing," Emma said to Edmund, her voice clear and proud. "I wanted you to know that I never stopped. And I wanted to tell the new king that we trust him because you taught him to be kind like you are." Alexander, watching from the doorway with his mother and sister, felt a profound sense of connection to the legacy his father had built. These children didn't see a disabled former king. They saw the man who had taken time to listen to their poems and encourage their dreams. That was the kind of ruler Alexander aspired to be. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in the small private dining room they had always preferred over the grand state dining hall. It had become their tradition to share one meal together each day, a time to set aside the formal roles they played for the public and simply be a family. "I have an announcement," Isabella said as they finished their soup course. "Dr. Harrington and I have been working on a proposal for a new medical college here in Valdoria. We want to train doctors specifically for rural and underserved communities." Alexander looked up with interest. "Tell me more." "We would partner with existing universities, but focus on practical medicine, public health, and community service," Isabella explained, her enthusiasm evident. "Students would spend part of their training in village clinics and remote areas, learning to work with limited resources and serve people who might not otherwise have access to quality healthcare." Edmund nodded slowly, his eyes bright with approval. "Education and service combined. That's how we build a stronger kingdom." Queen Marianne smiled at her daughter. "Your father and I always hoped you would find a way to use both your medical training and your position to help people. This sounds perfect." The conversation continued with discussions of funding, logistics, and timeline. Alexander found himself energized by his sister's vision, already seeing how the medical college could become a model for other educational initiatives. These were the kinds of conversations that made him love being king, despite the weight of responsibility it carried. Later that evening, as the family prepared to retire for the night, Alexander found himself alone with his father in the king's study. The room remained much as it had always been, filled with books, maps, and the accumulated wisdom of decades of rule. Edmund moved more slowly now, but he still insisted on spending time here each day, reading, writing in his journal, and thinking about the kingdom he loved. "I need to tell you something, Alexander," Edmund said, settling carefully into his favorite leather chair. "These months since my stroke, watching you become the king I always knew you could be, have been among the happiest of my life." Alexander looked surprised. "Happy? But, father, you lost everything you worked for." Edmund shook his head firmly. "I lost the ability to rule, yes. But I gained something precious. The certainty that everything I worked for will continue and grow under your leadership. A king's greatest achievement is not what he accomplishes during his own reign, but what happens to his kingdom after he can no longer lead it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, father and son, former king and current king, watching the lights of their kingdom twinkle in the darkness beyond the windows. The candles that had burned during Edmund's illness had long since been extinguished, but new lights had taken their place, the steady glow of a people confident in their future. "The castle feels different now," Alexander mused. "Not sad anymore, but not quite the same as it was before." Edmund smiled. "It feels like hope, my son. The stones remember the sorrow, but they also remember that we survived it, that we came through it stronger and more united. That's what this castle has always been, not just a symbol of power, but a symbol of endurance." As the two kings, father and son, prepared to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, the ancient stones of Valdoria Castle settled around them with the weight of history and the lightness of hope. The palace had not fallen silent after all. It had simply learned to sing a new song, one of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds that hold a family and a kingdom together through even the darkest of times.